2026 is becoming very quickly a very nasty year for the Russian armed forces. All of their advances on the front line has pretty much stalled, and more than that, Ukraine has actually reported that in the month of May, they regained more territory than lost. So suddenly, Russia is not only not advancing, but it is Ukraine that is taking the initiative and regaining their territory. More than that, Russian military bloggers are now crying wolf and stating that potentially Ukrainians are preparing for something big. Hey there, Georgie here with Ukraine Matters. I made a video where I talked about how this war could end. However, 2026 truly threw a wrench in all of my calculations. And in reality, Ukraine has opened new possibilities for this war to end. This will be the first video in the series in which I will analyze how Ukraine actually can absolutely win this war in 2026. Today, we're going to be talking at the military victory that Ukraine can achieve. Let's start by looking at the claim, and then we're going to transition into the data points to see whether or not the data supports that claim. And the claim is very simple. Ukraine has a victory plan. I'm talking about the military victory plan. Ukraine even had it before in 2022, 2023 as well. It's just in 2023, they didn't have the resources to execute it. Arguably now, they have it, those resources. The plan is very simple, which is to cut out the Crimea by trying to cut out the land corridor to Crimea and then take out the bridge to Crimea, after which a significant portion of the Russian forces get encircled and really slowly squeezed out and defeated. Why this would work, and this is where the claim is that Putin is a military dictator. He transitioned from just being a dictator in Russia to now being a military dictator. So everything is dependent on his success in the war. And for Russia, there is a very clear victory path for their victory. Russia can claim victory if they capture Kyiv. That is enough for Putin. But there is also a defeat point. If Putin loses Crimea to Ukrainians, that is it. That is when whatever he does later on, trying to maybe recapture or trying to portray that he's capturing Donetsk, Luhansk, none of this will work. Losing Crimea is pretty much the end of Putin. Our first data point will be addressing why this plan can work at all. And the answer is very simple, because it happened before. It happened in Kherson, the big green thing that you see here, where Ukrainians actually isolated Russia due to geographical conditions by destroying a couple of bridges across the river and then starving out Russians until they were forced to flee. And the same can happen right now. Firstly, there is a lot of things that are happening already trying to soften up Russians for a potential Ukrainian attack. This is happening in the southern area of Ukraine, specifically across the land bridge. I'm not going to go too much into details for specific activities that Ukraine is doing. I would recommend maybe watching some friend of the channel like Underpak Nilsson. He goes in depth about what Ukraine is doing. We're going to approach this from why this is working and what specifically changed. To understand this, we need to understand that Russian tactics haven't really changed since they started the war. Yes, they've adapted how they are attacking Ukraine in the changing environment, but general principles stay the same. The key to victory over Russians in the way that Ukraine wants this is logistics. Logistics of Russians have been under pressure for a while now. Let's look at the full supply chain for the Russians, because surprisingly, the supply chain really hasn't improved for Russians. It is still the same. And most of it depends on, well, trains. Trains are the first and probably the most important step for the Russians. Trains deliver supplies to large stockpiles. From these large stockpiles, Russia then loads a lot of different trucks and armored vehicles that are taking them closer to the front line, somewhere around 100 kilometers at this point. And after they get to these smaller stockpiles closer to the front line, then either smaller vehicles or Russians on their feet or motorcycles are then getting those supply lines supplied to the actual Russian troops that are going towards Ukrainian positions to attack. That is the full supply chain. And Ukraine, that is majority led by competent people, has been actually working to erode this supply chain as much as they can. The first part that was eroded by Ukrainians is the part that is closer to the front line. This is something that we actually observe the most. It's the supply chain of getting the weapons to the troops. Firstly, the troops themselves are having trouble reaching the positions. We don't see large swaths of Russians just riding the tank, arriving to the front line. Now they are forced to approach the Ukrainian positions in a scattered formations with barely any connection to the outside world, just because Ukrainian drones are hunting them down. Then Ukrainians also improved the quantity of their drone presence on the front line, and now Russians that are trying to sneak in, that bring additional supplies or even drive them with the motorcycles, is being taken out concretely. There is very little automatic motorized transport that is right now delivering these supplies. The only kind of supplies that are still present is the Russian cargo drones that are delivering goods to these soldiers that are moving forward. But it's a very limited number. Instead of being a flow, it's barely a drip. Then another part that we also noted Ukraine was working on is the Russian stockpiles and their military logistics with the trains. The first hit against these massive supply stockpiles happened when Ukrainians got the HIMARS long-range systems. We saw a whole plethora of explosions. This has basically started the pattern of Ukraine striking these stockpiles more and more and more and more, pushing them further and further and further away from the front line, and also breaking them a little bit apart, becoming smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller. That complicated logistics. Then last year's Ukrainians went against the trains specifically. They targeted a lot of the Russian train lines, forcing Russia to complicate their train logistics, and once again moving these large stockpiles that can deliver the goods towards the front line even further away. This helped Ukraine initially, but longer term, Russia was still able to adapt. Mostly, as you can see, there was part of this equation that was just not targeted. Yes, Ukraine was able to strike some of these storage facilities that are some 100 kilometers, but usually they're either deep underground or they're masked, and it's pretty hard to get. And catching something like trucks, I mean, here and there, yes, but it's not a systemic approach so far. And now, with Ukrainians seeking these facilities, firstly, they increased the range of their tactical smaller drones. So a lot of these stockpiles that even were hidden or underground have been targeted by Ukrainian heavier drones. But more importantly, now even the trucks are being hunted by Ukrainians. So suddenly we are finding ourselves in a situation where not just parts of this logistics chain are being targeted by Ukraine, but Ukraine has the capabilities to erode the logistics chain fully. There is not anymore a step in logistics chains that Ukraine is not targeting, and that is a big change. Before we continue, I must remind you that what Ukraine is able to achieve on the front line is also thanks to you. And we must not stop and continue supporting Ukraine with their efforts. Participate in the fundraiser for the drones for the 93rd Brigade. We're going to do as much as we can to help Ukraine win. So now that we understood how the situation is different from Russian and you also enjoyed my artistic demeanor, let's move to talking about what Ukraine is gonna do to try to take over the Russians at the front line. And the answer is, as I explained, quite simple. It is to cut Russian forces in half And specifically, we're talking about this area. Now, there's various red herring statements that are being made by different analysts. And I think we need to outline the things that are relevant and things that are not relevant. Firstly, let's start with the big one. City of Mariupol and Berdyansk. Are Ukrainian forces forced to really fight for these cities? And in my perspective, the answer is no. I do not think that Mariupol or Berdyansk are right now a key targets for Ukraine. The main idea for Ukraine that Ukraine would want to achieve is they would like to cut this road over here completely. So to do so, they would need to approach this area in about 20-kilometer distance. If we look at the measurement, this is our guide. So for Ukraine to achieve their goals, they basically would need to kind of reach around this point. And here you can see the main target that Ukraine would want to get to, which is Melitopol. This is the main target that was also of the 2023 offensive. And most likely this could be also the target for this offensive. Essentially, if Ukraine is able to take Melitopol, that's it. That pretty much can win the war for Ukraine. Everything else is just going to get really worse and worse and worse for Russia. The forces that will be stranded on the east side, both in the southern Ukraine and also in Crimea itself, if they don't get any kind of proper supplies from the Russians from the right, because the Crimean bridge cannot handle massive supplies, it's just going to be a matter of time for Ukraine to smother these Russians out. Now let's talk about how Ukraine can do it, because while there are the obvious things, just take the direct route along the roads towards Melitopol, this is also the harder part. We are a little bit sort of blessed here, because while Russians have fortifications in the area, the infamous Surovikin line that is following all along the southern area, Russians have not really built additional reinforcements. And while Ukraine can try to advance through the southern direction, it is also going to be problematic. A much more interesting scenario, and once again, I'm not giving away here anything, this was Russians basically discussing themselves, is trying to hit Russians where they're not expecting it. Potentially at the areas around here where Ukrainians started doing some counteroffensive actions, or even more interesting, moving through Dnipro, because in this area where Dnipro used to be wide, now it is a lot more narrow because Russians destroyed the Novokakhovka Dam. And now this is a river with a sort of a swampy land that Ukrainians, in theory, can try to cross. And this would allow Ukraine to approach from the area where Russians don't have big fortification lines. Right now, the biggest threat is the Russian drones. That's the big thing. And the thing is that Russians are having issues even supplying these drones. So if Ukraine is able to concentrate their forces as one of the directions, there's a good chance that potentially Russians will not have the supplies necessary to really fight the Ukrainian advancing forces. And Ukraine would not need such a big advancing force altogether. It could be done relatively with relatively low number of troops. More importantly, we are potentially seeing Ukraine thinking ahead. And right now, when we're talking about Ukraine striking Russian logistics, yes, there is a lot of things that is happening here in the south, but actually Ukraine is working through this whole area, and they are sort of destroying the logistic capacity of Russians all the way here as well. So you can think about like the further it is away from here towards the western part of occupied territories, the less and less logistical support Russians have there. And potentially, if Ukrainians find some kind of creative way to cross the river, then suddenly there might not be an answer for Russians at all. So there are two questions left to answer. Should Ukraine do this, and can Ukraine do this? The should part is interesting because on one side, one might think, well, Ukraine is slowly winning over Russia. So potentially there is no reason for Ukraine to go into this offensive operation, sustain casualties, and potentially put themselves in a vulnerable situation. But I want to make sure that we understand precisely what is discussed here. Ukraine can technically perform an operation that completely sabotages the whole Russian campaign. That everything that Russia has gained on the battlefield can just be erased, and Ukraine arguably can secure a victory very fast. It is definitely a risk, and it would definitely require resources from Ukraine. So if we consider whether allowing this war to drag on and Ukraine slowly maybe getting stronger and stronger and stronger, but still every day costs lives of civilians, costs lives of military, it causes damages to Ukraine in many ways, and it prolongs the war, then potentially some kind of a riskier move is what is now being called for Ukraine to actually change the status quo. And I'm pretty sure a lot of Ukrainians would agree. And once again, if Ukraine starts gaining ground, you will just see how fast the shift in positive manner for Ukraine will shift. And the second part is whether or not Syrskyi will do it. Well, Syrskyi has actually been very sneaky. One of the reasons that Ukrainians are not having enough people on the front line is because Syrskyi has created these assault brigades. They are essentially hand-picked Syrskyi's units that he can deploy anywhere on the front line, and they're specifically tasked for counteroffensive or offensive actions. Now, there's a lot of criticism about them because people perceive war in different ways. And Syrskyi, he always plays in sort of a like, how can I attack you where you don't expect it or don't want to see me? And how can I, even with less force, achieve more than just gaining some ground? Kursk operation was great. Like it undermined so much of Russian advances in the front line. It was a fantastical operation. And now there's been a lot of criticism about these forces, but the reality is Ukraine has these forces. And these forces are stocked with manpower. These forces are stocked with equipment. Ukraine right now doesn't use a lot of equipment on the front line. And some people have been outlining that, and I'm talking about Russian propagandists here, so I'm not, once again, telling any secrets, is that Ukraine has been stockpiling resources for a potential offensive operation. It is true that Ukraine now has the resources to conduct the offensive action. And basically the question here is whether or not Syrskyi is brave enough to do any kind of offensive operation. And I think he is. I think this would play very well into his model of fighting the Russians. Now, it's not going to happen fast. I would say if we're looking at the timeline when this could happen, this is definitely closer to the end of the summer. I think the whole summer Ukrainians will start absolutely eradicating Russian logistics, trying to isolate this area. And I believe if they are successful, if Russians will not find an answer to this, then Ukrainians will have a great window of opportunity where they can strike massively against Russians. Some people ask the question, well, what prevents Russia from having their own mid-range drone and taking out Ukrainian logistics? And the important thing is to understand that war is necessarily temporary. So everything gives you just a window of opportunity in time until your opponent adapts. Right now, Ukraine has this short window where they are striking Russia at their weakest, and they're able to create the conditions necessary for potential future strike. And pretty much winning the war this year would be really fantastic development for all supporters of Ukraine. The next episodes that I'm going to make are going to be covering diplomatic conditions for Ukraine and also the economic war against Russia. There's a lot of pressure put on Russia on many fronts, and we're going to cover them. So continue supporting Ukraine, trust in Ukrainian armed forces. I love you. Slava Ukraini, and I will see you next time.